Well, initially, my way of dealing with it was not to deal with it. It's not that I ignored it. The condition doesn't let you do that, but I just went on with life. And I'm not sure if that's acceptance or denial. I think there's a fine line between the two. But even though I had this diagnosis and this new perspective on life, in practice, nothing had actually changed. I probably had this condition for some time, well before my diagnosis. The only difference now was that I knew about it. So as part of that getting on with it philosophy, I decided not to tell people. In fact, in the first few years, I could count on one hand the amount of people that I told. Telling people, it made it more real somehow, and I don't know, maybe that was denial, but I didn't want to dwell on it either, and I didn't want people to think of me differently. The other reason I didn't tell people is I could get away with it, quite frankly. I could still do most things. My symptoms weren't immediately obvious, and the medication kept things in check. I could still appear normal, on the outside at least, and if they didn't ask, I didn't tell. I just didn't feel the need to tell people, and quite honestly, I couldn't be bothered with people's reactions. Even today, most people don't know. I guess doing things like this video will change that, but it's almost like a coming out process of sorts. But I still find it strange to talk about. Even when I hear myself saying it out loud that I have Parkinson's, it still feels odd. It's like it's happening to someone else. I mean, how do you tell people? How do you find the right words, the right moment? There's no rule book for this, and it's not something you can casually drop into conversation either. You can't just tell people you have Parkinson's and leave it at that, or I didn't think I could. I mean, most people either have some appreciation of the condition, you know, their uncle has it, or their neighbour has it, or they recall some celebrity that has it. For others, and I probably would have included myself in this, they're simply not familiar with it, at least not in any detail. And either way, when I told people, I felt like I had to educate them on the condition and my particular version of it. And by doing so, I had to relive it every time, and that was just depressing. And as I started telling more people, I would notice certain patterns emerged, the same questions, the same reactions kept coming up. It became almost predictable. There were common reactions like, but you're so young. That was probably the most common, as most people tend to think of it as a condition of the elderly. Or you look so well was another. Not understanding maybe an hour ago, before my medication kicked in, maybe I didn't look so well, or indeed understanding that looking well and being well are two different things. And that's not unique to this condition, but so much of Parkinson's is about the stuff you can't see. I mean, people tend to go with what they can see. Most people can associate with the physical symptoms like a tremor, but tend to be oblivious to things like fatigue or apathy or mood fluctuations or changes to bodily functions or cognitive impact or any of the other hidden symptoms of this complex condition. It's difficult to convey. I have a friend who, before being diagnosed with Parkinson's, had prostate cancer. He told me once he found telling people that he had cancer was actually easier than telling people he had Parkinson's, because it was more black and white. There was more awareness, and it required less explanation. I thought that was amazing. Others are just shocked initially when you tell them, and they don't say much there and then. Instead, they'd go away and mull it over, by which I mean they'd go away and Google it. They'd often sort of come back to me a few days later, and they might send me a link to an article about a miracle cure or a breakthrough treatment. Have you seen this or tried that? As if the answer was out then, it was just a matter of Googling it. I think that's just their process. It was similar to the process that I went through and still go through. People want to understand, they want to help, but they don't know how, and you feel their helplessness and you almost end up supporting them. And maybe I was just being selfish, but that felt like a burden that I didn't need. Unfortunately, the result of all of that is you can become more detached from people, more withdrawn, more reserved. There's something about the condition that can make you more insular, and that can be dangerous. You go out less, you socialise less, committing to things socially becomes an issue. I mean, I wouldn't know how I'd feel at the time, and I'd feel bad if I had to change plans last minute. I'd shy away from big gatherings. I became aware, even embarrassed, that I wasn't the person they remembered. And I wouldn't say I was ever the life and soul of the party, but I'm aware I've lost some of my fizz, my energy, my personality even, and I was conscious that others could see that. And as a result, some friendships change, some get more distant. But in most cases, I found when you're able to open up, those bonds get stronger and deeper, and I consider myself very lucky to have supportive people in my life like that. Very lucky. Well, telling my parents was the most difficult thing. I put it off for years, as long as I could, and I had a natural instinct to protect them, and I didn't want them to worry. But parents sense these things, and by not telling them, it probably made them worry more. I knew they'd feel an immense amount of sorrow and a natural instinct to help, yet at the same time feel helpless. And as a parent, and I'm not one myself, that must be one of the most difficult things. But I'm fortunate, my parents and my family are very supportive, and they get it. We talk about it more, and they understand the condition. I think, like me, they also had an instinct initially to keep it quiet and not tell others. I think it's one of those Asian traits, perhaps, to keep it within the family. And sometimes that works, but I've seen other instances of families keeping things like this quiet out of embarrassment, or worse still, for fear of losing face within the community, and that's not healthy for anyone. But I'm lucky, my parents put me and my well-being first, and I realise that's not the case for everyone, and I'm fortunate to be in that position.
Would you remember me 1 year?
1 year?
Yes.
Yes.
Remember me in 3 years?
Yes, I will remember in few years.
2 years?
Yes, I will remember in 2 years.
Would you remember me in 3 years?
Yes, I will remember in 3 years.
Would you remember me in 4 years?
Yes, I will remember you in 4 years.
Knock, knock.
Knock, knock.
Knock, knock.
Hello, Puan.
You know me.
Don't.
This is it. When you say knock, knock, and the other person says, who's there? Then you say, no, you don't remember me. You don't.
As people with Parkinson's, we're conscious the burden we place on our loved ones. It's a very humbling feeling, especially as you start to lose your independence. I was on a Zoom call recently, and it was one of those mindfulness sessions, and most people on the call had Parkinson's, and one lady who was the partner of an elderly man with the condition. She'd been with her husband for years, a lifetime, and he had the double whammy of Parkinson's and dementia. And she was saying it was one thing to see his physical deterioration, but it was another to see his thoughts and his memories start to go, and how she felt he was a different person now. Yet she'd always stand by him. Even though caring for him was a 24/7 thing, she wouldn't have it any other way. It was sad to hear, but what really got me was she was a quiet, modest woman, and she wasn't moaning, she wasn't complaining, and she didn't have any other outlet aside from this weekly group, and you could see the toll, the burden it was having. And she said something that made me sad but almost angry at the same time. She was almost apologetic for joining the group, conscious that everyone else had the condition and she was merely the carer of somebody with it. She said something like, "I know I shouldn't be here. I know I'm not the one living with Parkinson's." And I said, "Nonsense. You are, by very definition, living with Parkinson's. You're absolutely impacted by this." And I felt like saying to her and the millions of other partners out there that as people with Parkinson's, we're forever grateful for the support you give. We wouldn't be here, or we certainly wouldn't be the same without you. That's probably another area of my life that's changed due to Parkinson's, in that I'm no longer with the partner I had when I was originally diagnosed. In retrospect, it wasn't the healthiest of relationships, and it took the condition to make me realise that, and I mean that quite literally actually. I remember early on, shortly after being diagnosed, I was at home one day with my girlfriend at the time, and we were having this argument about whose turn it was to do the washing up or something insignificant like that. Anyway, there was some effing and blinding going on, and mainly on her part, I should add. This went on for a while, and all of a sudden, she, while we were in mid-flow, in mid-argument, she just stopped, and she was just staring at me, staring down to my side and my hand specifically, and I didn't know what was going on at first until I caught my reflection in the mirror, and I could see my tremor was going at a rate of knots, and I hadn't noticed it until then, but it became obvious to me at that point that how the state of my mind was impacting the state of my body and vice versa, and how the two are so intrinsically linked. And that's so tangible in Parkinson's. The more stressed or agitated I was, the worse my symptoms got. It was like my tremor was acting as a barometer for the state of my mind. Fortunately, the opposite is true as well. The best days now are when I'm relaxed and happy and all my symptoms are much better. And that's not a coincidence. The same thing in our brain that's controlling our movement is also controlling our mood. I'm now in a much healthier, more loving, more supportive relationship, and I feel a lot better for it. I also got a dishwasher, which helped. Fortunately, I was still able to work, and I'm glad I did. It gave me focus. I've always had a healthy work-life balance, or rather I've kept the two separate, and in that sense not telling my colleagues, my employers came naturally. I didn't have any qualms about that. There were a couple of exceptions, but in the main I kept my condition quiet at work. I became adept at concealing my symptoms. If I was in a meeting room with 10 other people, for example, I would make sure everyone else was sitting to the right of me, because most of my symptoms are on the left side. I would sit on my hand to conceal a tremor. I would cross my legs to hide any twitching movement. Medication timing became an issue sometimes if I was stuck in a long meeting or in an open plan office. I would subtly take my pills without people noticing. Most people were none the wiser. It didn't always work. Sometimes the more conscious you are of your symptoms, the more you try to hide them, the more obvious they become. But as with friends and family, it started to take more and more effort to conceal and hide the condition. you just get to a certain point. And I'd love to say that I started telling people when I reached a point of acceptance, but in reality, I told people when I couldn't hide it any longer. My symptoms became more and more obvious, and I could still carry on working, but I wouldn't be left with much in the tank at the end of the day or even during the day, and I started to resent my work as a result. And as the pandemic hit and I had a chance to reflect, I decided to quit that kind of work, office work. And now I'm doing a few different things. Having this condition and looking after yourself, it's like having a full-time job in itself. It takes effort, but it's important to prioritise and be on top of as much as possible. I'm also putting my experience of developing products and technology to good use by developing a service for people with Parkinson's, a smartphone app that helps people track their condition and their symptoms and their medication. So that's exciting. I'm doing more creative things recently, which I've never had a chance to do. It's the first time work and personal life have overlapped in that way, and ironically, it's taken Parkinson's to do that. I'm also more involved in the Parkinson's world than I used to be. I do some volunteer work for charities. I run a small group for young people with neurological conditions. I give talks to medical students at a local university, and I'm more engaged in the research world as well. I'm even starting a podcast with a fellow Parky friend of mine. And I'm doing nothing more than sharing my experiences of living with Parkinson's, but I've come to realise that has value. And even though I'm not naturally one to share, I feel like it's almost my responsibility to do so. And along the way, I've met some amazing people with the condition or have a connection with it. And it's like you're a member of this exclusive club and you have this common connection. It's comforting to talk to others with the condition or that can relate. They just get it. You don't have to explain. And I always think empathy trumps sympathy in that way. But it wasn't always like that for me. I remember early on going to a support group for people with Parkinson's. There were about 10 people there, and I think my attendance brought the average age of the group down quite considerably. It's not only that everybody was a good deal older than me, just from a lifestyle point of view, we were different. They were retired, had kids, grandkids, spent most of the time at home, and I was still working, trying to be active and sociable, and I just couldn't relate. It was also depressing to see people with more advanced Parkinson's, and it was a reminder of what was to come, and I didn't want to see that, not at that point anyway. And the few youngsters I met, some weren't coping very well. I remember one guy, about my age, worked in the city and recently diagnosed like me. I was chatting to him and being friendly in my usual way, and he was looking at me and I could see the anxiety in his eyes. You could tell the news of his diagnosis had consumed him. And after a while he said to me, "How can you remain upbeat when you know what's coming?" He was confused, almost taken aback that I wasn't appearing to be in the same state that he was. I said, "Look, there's two ways to look at this. We know that this is a progressive condition and there's no way to stop it. And by definition, it will get worse. Each new day will be worse than the day before. And in that sense, today is as good as it's going to get. Or you can flip that round and say to yourself, well, actually, today is as good as it's going to get. Today is going to be my best day. So why not make the most of it?" And there's a tendency to focus on the negatives, what may or may not come in the future. Things you can't control, or dwell on the things you can no longer do, rather than take comfort from the things you can do. I never saw that guy again, and in fact I stopped going to groups like that for many years, as I didn't want to be exposed to all that, and maybe I just wasn't ready. it's a traumatic time for the newly diagnosed. You're in a vulnerable place. I see it in others now, and I really feel for them. Having a positive, I'd even say a realistic attitude is so important. Pessimism tends to spiral, and it's not easy, and it takes effort, but you can have a decent quality of life with Parkinson's. In a way, the condition teaches you a lot about life and yourself, and I don't think I'd be the same person now, appreciating life in the way that I do, if I hadn't had this condition.